How y'all doing? For this book review, it's actually going to be a double feature. And it's going to be Edgar Rice Burroughs again. And this is also one of his famous ones. I mean, of course, when you think Edgar Rice Burroughs, the main two ones you're famous for is Tarzan, or in his first book that he published made famous, as John Carter of Mars. But he's also written other books, and independent books, and somebody wrote many series there, like Land of Time Forgot, which I've yet to read. Now, I'm covering the first two books of this series for two reasons. One, that's as far as I got into this series up to this point, and two, it's best to have them back to back because one leaves on a cliffhanger just to finish off the second one. So I may end up spoiling the first one, but I would suggest get the two together if you want to start reading this. That is, At the Earth's Core, and that is in the sequel, Pellucidar. Sorry if the light is give you a good look at the cover here. Now, as you notice, there are different sizes here, and that's because I got this one first at Half Price Bookstore, which sells the old paperbacks. And so I said, okay, I need to get the first one. So I went to Amazon, and I found one of the original cover, but Amazon doesn't explain the dimensions of the book, and since it's public domain, apparently sometimes they publish it in this size. One of these days, I'll get one of the appropriate sizes here to complement it. Till then, this will do. Now, in case you're curious, the cover art is Roy Crinkle Jr. He's done a lot of artwork for Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff, and I think it's very nice. If it's not him, it's usually Frank Frazetta. Both are good. So, what's the concept of At the Earth's Core? Well, this is a Hollow Earth setting. What is that? Well, it was an idea that came up, I think, around the 1600s, but it's been used in fiction for a little while after that, and this is one of the most famous ones. Of course, Edgar Rice Burroughs didn't come up with it, of course. I mean, Jules Verne's came up with it with Journey to the Center of the Earth. So, but the idea of this is a series of books covers about 6 books, 7 if you count the crossover. Yes, there's a crossover where it's Tarzan at the Earth's Core. So, but I haven't got into that to those ones, so we're going to cover the first 2. And again, if you want, I suggest if you want to start with this, make sure you get the first 2 because that way you're not left off at a cliffhanger. So this one was originally the first book. At the Earth's Core was originally published in All Story Weekly in 1914, and about 8 years later they made the hardcover. And the story begins with a man doing lion hunts in the Sahara. Comes across a man who just came out what looks like a giant drill. He's dressed in sort of primitive clothing, and he's carrying this weird, interesting little creature that's tied up. He introduces himself as David Ines, and so he tells this story. So David Ines was the son of a very rich miner. He's learning it. His father owned a mine. He was learning his trade. This is where you're introduced to the guy and his moral character. A lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs characters are good moral characters and stuff like that. They're just good, all around good people, and try to do good in the world. Now, as he's learning the business, he meets up and befriends an old scientist, an engineer named Dr. Abner Perry. He creates a gigantic drill meant to drill in as far as it can to the Earth's crust and see what's down there. So when they get this thing built, and they travel down several hundred miles, and it gets hot, gets cold, and eventually they break through. They thought they hit the Earth's surface again, just sort of made a U-turn. Nope, just went straight down, and they found out an interesting primitive-like world. And as they were exploring, they got out and explored a little bit, and eventually they were attacked by a giant, monstrous mammalian beast. Later, they recognized that as a megatherium, which is a giant ground sloth. They got separated during the attack, and David Ines gets captured by this, primitive tribe of apes that have been swinging in the trees and using hunting dogs. And when they capture him, they strip him of his clothes, and now he's in primitive gear. And then later meets up with David Ines, also stripped of it, and they were sent to these giant ape-like creatures called Shoggoths. So they apparently these Shoggoths are collecting slaves because they attached to a huge slave train and journeyed for a while. Now the description of Flucidar is basically it's a hollow world where once you break through, the surface is in the inside of the Earth. Instead of us on the surface, this is on the inside of the curvature. They have this huge giant sphere that gives continuous sunlight. There is no dark at all. And so it distorts their sense of time and everything. So there's no night or day and everything like that. That plays an important part in events, in the story. So with that, and also they find out later on that where the oceans of our surface are, that's where land is, and where land is, that's where the oceans are. And of course, they have it's very lush environments with these huge primitive creatures, from old mammals to dinosaurs and various other things as well. So, okay, back to the story. David Hines and Perry are now part of the slave train, where they actually meet and befriend some of the other slaves over there, human, of course. They meet up with Gak, the hairy one, Hooja, the sly one, and of course, the main female lead for David Hines' love interest, Dean Beautiful. You can see what the names are at. It's kind of silly, but if you're a young reader this time, this is acceptable. You go with it. Okay, so if you Ian, and Perry find a way to communicate with everybody, and he tries to get to know Dean for a while. Now, Hooja, the sly one, tries to take Dean while they're on the slave train. David Hines interferes, but when he saves her from him, she spurns him. She rejects him, doesn't look at him or anything. They were getting along great, but after that, what gives? Well, after a while, while she's rejected, the slave train goes on. They go into one of a few dark places, which is a dark tunnel, and somehow, as they went through, Hooja, the sly one, and Dean end up missing. But despite all that, the slave train keeps going. Perry finds out that, according to the people's customs, once you save a woman like that, there's a custom you have to do where you take the hand, put over head, let it drop, because when you do that, you take the woman as a slave or a wife or things like that, or you take the hand gesture and let her go. He didn't do that. He was unaware of their customs, so now she's now missing, hating him. Well, that's kind of unfortunate. He wants to reconcile that. But slave trade moves on, and the Shoggoths take the human slaves to a city where the rulers are these big pterosaurs. Rhamphorhynchus is in particular called Mahars. I'll show you a picture here just to give you a basic example of what Rhamphorhynchus in general looks like. Something like this. They're primitive pterosaurs, large tail and all that, but they're one of the earliest pterosaurs known. But these are not your typical pterosaur, Rhamphorhynchus, which pretty small. These are a little bit larger, much more intelligent. They have a way of mentally communicating with each other, not strictly telepathy. They kind of, Perry, conceives that they use like a fourth dimension way of communicating with themselves. So they're incapable of speech, but they communicate with a sort of a mental ability. So now that's where the humans are taken. They're now slaves to the Mahars, where they're used for, for slave work, labor, entertainment, what have you. It's actually pretty horrifying what they do to these people. It's one of the most brutal I've ever read. Edgar Rice Burroughs, how they, in his description of what happens to them. But while they're slaves there, Perry gets a hold of their library of knowledge. He, looks at their books, but he also finds out more about Flucidar, and Perry finds out an interesting secret about the reproduction of the Mahars. It's kept very secret. He finds it in a book, and he eventually takes it with him, because eventually he finds a way to escape. During a botched arena event between two other slaves, things went sour, and Perry David Hines escapes. And this is where he has further adventures. He meets other tribes. He faces other monsters. He's trying to find Dean the Beautiful, but and he also has the Book of the Great Secret there. So one of the things he finds out that's horrifying of the Mahars is that there's this interesting ritual about taking some of these humans enslaved by their mental powers. They take them to this pool where the Mahars swim in and start biting off pieces of them. Very cruel. As I say, it's most brutal I've ever read Burroughs in description of what he did to him. He may have done it in other books, but this is what little I've read. That's the most horrifying things. But there's also more as well. Now, he eventually finds his way back at because he has to go back to the city where Perry, despite the length of time, that his travels, Perry's like, you've been gone a while? The Pellucidar distorts their sense of time and everything, and they try to work that in to events of the story. I don't think best efficiently, but I'm digressing here. I'll explain that later. So eventually, Perry is interrogated by Mahars, is chained up again to another horrifying scene where you see the Mahars doing surgical experimentation on humans, and again, very horrifying manner. But eventually, he finds ways to escape with him and Perry this time, and they go and they try and as they leave, he eventually finds Deanne the Beautiful and tries and saves her from being taken again. Venture reconciles everything. I'm going to shorthand that on how that works. But eventually they find a way to lead a revolt with the other tribes against the Mahars and Shoggoths with a couple new intrusive weapons that they never had before. And eventually they conquer them. Well, they don't conquer them, they defeated them. And now Perry and Ainz are now trying to unite the tribes, where now Perry will be the new leader, new emperor, and all of that. So they have grand plans to make a brand new empire out of this new world. The book ends because when they use the mold to go back, because despite the attempts, they don't have full knowledge themselves on new weapons technology that can help these people out. So David Ainz was going to take Deanne back to the surface, get the knowledge, and come back and start a new empire. Well, Huja, the Sly One, interferes, takes Deanne away, and makes David Ainz thinks something's wrong, and then so he goes off alone, but he finds a small Mahar to try that they captured. He's stuck with it. Huja was trying to use the Mahar as a means to try and kill him on the way upward. The first book roughly ends there. I shorthanded a little bit with a lot of details, and again, yes, it is a bit spoiling of it, but I said you have to, because I have to get into the sequel book, which continues on with that, because the first book ends on a cliffhanger. Because David Ainz, when he gets back to the surface, he realized 10 years has passed. That's how much time's distorted here. So, on to Flucidar, the sequel here. Alright, so this one was serialized in All Stories Weekly in 1915 and was novelized in 1923. And now Ainz and Mahar, they travel back, and with the modern knowledge and technology, they grab books and stuff like that, and they go back to Flucidar. And let's see, Perry finds out that the united tribes that he tried to bring together, they've now broken up thanks to Huja, and now this is him going on a series of adventures to try and fix all that. He has to deal with the Mahars again because he still has the book of their great secret, and Huja has been trying to interfere again and again. He's trying to get Deanne the Beautiful and all that, and and I will shorthand he eventually does succeed in the end. It seems much shorter one, but it's a decent sized details there, because if I spoil the first one, I can at least spare you the details of the second one. But again, you want to read them back to back on that. Okay, so I enjoyed these two books very much. I mean, enjoying the old pulps, especially the old prehistoric environments and all that. Of course, while Edgar Rice Burroughs tends to use as much as he can of prehistoric life, some of them are, like the Megatherian, saber-toothed cats, the few dinosaurs there, like the Mahars and all that. He does exaggerate them a tad bit. I mean, things like the giant sloth and all that, and wolves are, it does exaggerate too much. But Mahars being, these creatures of intelligence and all that, and giant ape-like tribes and everything. They have these huge, one of the tribe people use, sauropods, as you can see from this blown up cover for this paperback here, and stuff and everything. And of course, there's probably other monsters that are not actual animals that exist at a time, just monsters set up for here. They have their own names. And so from that point, if you just take it for a good adventure story, nothing strictly scientific, it's a lot of fun. If I had to give it a flaw, it's the typical one I tend to find out. After reading this, it's one of the ones that tends to, I'm not saying bother me, but something I tend to notice is that the endings come fast. It's just, huge series of events, and then, last chapter, it ends very quickly after you're going through the pace and all that. I tend to notice that with a couple of his other works. That's not bad. It's not bad. I mean, at least he ends it, decently. You can imagine the good things in between. But one of the things I've also found that doesn't quite work with me is the pacing of events. when you read the story, to me, I don't know if I can say this right, due to the nature of Pellucidar and how there's no real sense of travel from Perry and David Hines' perspective, and I should reverse that. Main character's David Hines, Perry's his friend. They, because there's no sense of day and night, there's no sense of time, so things are a little bit longer than all that. But when you read the books, it reads reads at a different pace than what actual time they say happened. This kind of intertwines with how this thing ends, because in the end they have this they not only bring the knowledge to them, they quickly build an advanced navy against their enemies. And when you read this, it's kind of like, okay, this is happening too fast, but he tried to explain that off, that you have no real sense of time, so things are actually longer than they appear. I don't think it fully works. I understand what they're going for, but it just doesn't quite fully work. Maybe because they hasn't really done a sense of people measuring time from one to another. But you figure there may be some measurement because of, have to get things done even as a primitive society. But I could be wrong on that. But it doesn't distract from. It's just something I noticed there that's not really bothersome. Certainly, I noticed that if you were writing a story like this today, you kind of have to work that up to be, a better pacing and everything like that. But other than that, it's a very good two-parter stories here. Interesting note off the side. If you buy or are a subscriber to Prehistoric Times magazine, I have here issue 129, spring of 2019. Philip Curry, that's paleontologist Philip Curry, for those of you who know. I grew up watching him throughout the 80s and 90s, so I'm quite familiar with him. He's a Canadian paleontologist, and he has an article in this one about his enjoyment. He's talking about the animal life of Pellucidar. Apparently, there's also another one in issue 128. So if you could probably look up the back issues on Prehistoric Times website. 128 and 129, you have Philip J. Curry talking about Pellucidar and from Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. Also, another thing which I think I kind of mentioned already. Another thing that's a bit, again, this is typical of the time, but it seems kind of silly to modern readers. The names of the inhabitants of Pellucidar, like Gak the Hairy One, Hooja the Sly One, and Dian the Beautiful. Again, if you're a young reader, this you kind of go by with this. But for an older adult, this may seem kind of silly and cartoonish, because you almost like, for instance, Hooja the Sly One. That reason tells you that's the villain right there. They also have another one, Jubal the Ugly One. They got names like that. Again, it's not a huge distraction, but it's a case of the Sly One. Granted, you could probably argue this character was written in another way. He could have been a good guy who's good and resourceful and all that, but you gotta have a villain, and obviously this one turned out to be Hairy One, not so much. The Beautiful, obvious. The Ugly One, obviously a villain here off the side. But they have names like that. Not a real distraction there, but this may seem kind of silly to a modern reader, but you just go with it because that's good classic stuff at the time, and it was highly influential. You could find modern comics and stuff like that. There, of course, you got the movie from 1976, At the Earth's Core, which stars Doug McClure and Peter Cushing, and of course, appropriately Caroline Munro as Dian the Beautiful. No arguments there. Also, speaking of which, Dark Horse Comics has a wonderful adaptation of the first book. As far as I know, they didn't make the second one, but I'll link it down below. I've looked through this, and it's a very faithful adaptation with a very appropriate artwork that complements similarly to the style that you find in these old covers. So, if you go to a local comic book store or go to Dark Horse Comics, I'll link it down below, and you might find enjoyment over there. And again, it's very accurate because I looked through it, and while I was reading the first book, read chapters of the first book, then go over to sections in the comic. They got it pretty accurately done. I wish they did a sequel one at least and continue that. But for those who are interested, look into that. So there you are. That is rough. Well, one more detail to the other of At the Earth's Core and the sequel book Pellucidar. The other books include Tanar of Pellucidar, Tarzan at Dearest Core, Back to the Stone Age, Land of Terror, and Savage Pellucidar. Will I get to reading those? Not quite certain. But if you're interested in the old pulps and those old adventures that, you can't go wrong with Burroughs. And it's nice, and other things that the concept of Dearest Core, as it is influence. It influences Dungeons and Dragons, Hollow Earth, which is set in Mystara. You can look at Mr. Welch, who's a man who's trying to make the Dungeons and Dragons setting Mystara into the 5th edition. But he has a whole slew of videos, and he talks about the Hollow Earth, and a lot of that, resonates with the with Edgar Rice Burroughs' setting. It's a bit different, of course, because a way they presented that, but you could tell this is influenced by Edgar Rice Burroughs. But it's also influenced a lot of things. So I always tell people, if you're interested in fantasy and science fiction, go back to the classics. Go to the node of those branches that influence things that you like today. Like, you want to watch Warhammer 4, you're into Games Workshop there. Yes, you can read their current lore, but a lot of that stuff, stolen, of course. They've taken that from Heinlein, Moorcock, and all that. But you once you got the literary reference there, you kind of see where where this is derived from. Nothing new under the sun here from the translated Latin. But there you go. I'm digressing again. So there you go. After Your Core, Flucidar, give it a shot. And if you like them, check the other ones out. I haven't read them yet, but I'm sure if you enjoy them, you should be able to join them too. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.